Good morning, YouTube. All right. Good morning, Instagram. Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show, brought to you by the Institute of Clinical Excellence. My name is Julie Brower, and I am one of many members of our older adult division. So because it is Wednesday, it's Jerry on Ice Day, we are going to talk a little bit about what MMOA is up to. So I said I am one of many members of our older adult division. Our team is growing, which is awesome. And we are growing because you all want more MMOA out in the world, which is amazing. So let's talk about some courses that are coming up. We are getting so busy that now we are having 2 teams on the same weekend flying across the country, which is so amazing. So first off, online course. Our next online course is not until August 17th. So that's our 8-week online course, August 17th. On the road for the rest of the summer, you can catch us on June 11th. We will be in Arizona and we will be in Florida. So again, our team is just spreading out across the country on these weekends. It's so amazing to see that. And then in August, on 13th and 14th, we will be in Maryland. And then on the 27th, we will be in South Carolina. So if you wanted to jump in a course for the rest of the summer, for online or live, go to ptonice.com, check it out. And as always, message any of us and we'll be happy to answer any questions for you. Okay, so our topic today, blood pressure and Parkinson's disease, significance over sexiness. We are talking all things blood pressure monitoring with these folks today. What we are not going to talk about at all for this entire podcast is appropriately dosed exercise. Only blood pressure monitoring. So we just need to realize that as clinicians, we can have a massive role in helping to manage chronic disease and many of our sick folks. In particular, in this case, autonomic dysfunction in folks who have Parkinson's disease. This is what we call in the older adult division, significance over sexiness. A lot of the time we want to focus on the motor features of Parkinson's disease, and we want to kind of jump right to what can we load them up with? How can we bring in those sexy deadlifts and squats, even with blood pressure issues on board? That is important. However, we can have many times a bigger impact if we start to help to manage some of these chronic disease factors that are on board. So by the end of this podcast, I'm hoping that you guys are thinking, I'm going to ditch the deadlifts today and start a blood pressure diary. So a couple weeks ago, Alex started this awesome discussion about why it is so important to screen blood pressure in these folks. And when we think about the bottom line of why it is so important, we know that when we have these non-motor symptoms on board, right? These non-motor features, including autonomic dysfunction, we know that they have a massive impact on quality of life and life expectancy. And what we know is that this early onset of cardiovascular autonomic dysfunction in this population is associated with poor prognosis and the development of cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, cerebrovascular disease, and cognitive impairment. So this has to be on our radar. We can get folks strong as an ox who have Parkinson's disease, but if we are not taking note and helping to manage these other factors, we're really missing the boat on improving their quality of life and improving just thinking about their longevity down the road. So Alex's discussion focused on a very common abnormal blood pressure profile that's typically on board, which is orthostatic hypotension, which is probably something that many of us pay attention to and many of us are aware of because we're the ones who are going in, getting people up and moving, and we are catching orthostatic hypotension all the time. So, what I want to talk about is the other side of the coin: high blood pressure and associated abnormal blood pressure profiles that may not be on our radar. They weren't on mine, but they absolutely need to be. So, I was just recently working with a patient in the home health setting who has Parkinson's disease. She was referred to us after she had a fall, and she had hypertension, and she occasionally would have orthostatic hypotension, but they've been managed with medications. However, after she had this fall, hospitalization, she had this prolonged time of immobilization, her blood pressure became just crazy volatile. I would come in to see her, and lying supine at rest, she could be 180 to 200 over 115. She could sit up, and then that blood pressure would normalize. But then when she would stand, she could drop into the 90s over 50s. I mean, we're talking a drop from almost 200 to 90 or below within a few minutes. It was absolutely wild. And Alex and I were literally sending screenshots of these crazy blood pressures back to one another, and starting this conversation. And it's really going to be awesome that you guys go back and listen to Alex's discussion to kind of really hear about orthostatic hypotension. And then we'll put it together with high blood pressure issues today. So you kind of have this comprehensive consideration of the whole picture here. So as I was noticing these crazy blood pressure values, I was just like, what the heck is going on, right? So I started to look into the literature, and what I found is that high blood pressure is actually a major, major, major issue with these folks. So I found a systematic review that's from 2021, and it looked at over 3,000 individuals, older adults with Parkinson's disease, average age over 60, and it investigated their abnormal blood pressure profiles as measured by ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. Basically meaning that cuff is on and it's taking a constant measure every 15 to 30 minutes throughout the entire day. So what we found is that there is definitely orthostatic hypotension on board, but there's these other abnormal blood pressure profiles, including supine hypertension and then reduced and reversed dipping. Two things that I really didn't know at all before looking into the research. So supine hypertension is specifically in individuals who have known orthostatic hypotension, and it's defined as systolic blood pressure at or above 140 over at or above 90. And that's being measured after at least 5 minutes of rest in the supine position. Dipping status, this reduced or reversed dipping status, is basically describing daytime BP versus nighttime BP. So normally, we should see a lower average blood pressure at night versus daytime, with nighttime values dipping between 10 and 20% from the daytime average blood pressure values. So we should see blood pressure that is lower at night versus the daytime. That's normal. When we have reduced dipping, the average nighttime blood pressure values show a less than 10% dip with respect to those daytime averages. And then reversed dipping is when blood pressure at night does not dip or go down at all, and it actually increases. So as I was sitting here thinking, I'm like, supine hypertension, nighttime hypertension, like these are things that have not completely been on my radar at all. And what we see is we look more into the literature that supine hypertension, if you just kind of think about hypertension in general, Like, we know that this can result in hypertensive emergencies, cerebral hemorrhage, acute pulmonary edema, and organ failure. And then if we have this elevated blood pressure at night, which we would call nocturnal hypertension, that's what it's called in the literature, it causes this increased sodium excretion. That's going to lead to an excess urine production, which can lead to sleep disturbances in an individual because they're getting up and going to the bathroom constantly. So there we have an issue where we're creating an increased risk of falling, getting up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. And then on top of that, it puts someone at increased risk of just having this massive volume depletion, which can exacerbate orthostatic hypotension in the morning. So it becomes just this vicious cycle of all these things that are happening overnight, starting with this issue of pure supine hypertension that we're probably not aware of at all. Like, if we think about when we get a resting blood pressure measurement, typically we are having these folks sit up on the edge of the bed and we're taking a value there. Not always are we having someone lie there for at least 5 minutes to get a supine measurement, right? And then we're definitely not there at nighttime to get a nighttime blood pressure measurement. So we're totally missing out on that. And even if patients are measuring their own blood pressure, typically we're telling them, and their doctors are telling them, yeah, just get it a couple times a day in the morning when you wake up, maybe midday. Not many patients are being told who have Parkinson's disease to measure what their nighttime blood pressure is. So when we think like we are getting this comprehensive view of someone's blood pressure profile, when we see these folks and we put them through exercise, we're actually missing a lot. And that just goes to show that, of course, the snapshot that they get when they're in the doctor's office is not giving them sufficient information either. So the question then becomes, what do we do about this? All right. So when I think about when I was going in to see my patient, what am I going to do? I know that this funky blood pressure is on board, and I had a choice. I could have decided to, sit him up, take a blood pressure, maybe send a little note to the doctor, and then just figure out exercise that I can do that doesn't exacerbate this funky blood pressure. Give them some stuff in supine, sitting, like just try and load them appropriately. If I can get them doing a cool deadlift with something awesome. Because that, like, by default for me is where I feel like I'm bringing the most value. I wouldn't want to leave that session without getting a bunch of exercise in because I would feel like I didn't do anything for the patient. But I really had to challenge myself, and I want to challenge you guys to try and think differently. To make the choice to say, I am going to do what I can to help manage this chronic disease, to help gather the data about these blood pressures. I'm going to ditch the deadlifts for the day. Not to say that finding exercise to do to work with and around abnormal blood pressure is not important, because it is. We know that increased levels of immobility is going to exacerbate that autonomic dysfunction. However, we need to triage. We have to triage first and foremost what is important. And I guarantee you what is important to that patient is that they start to feel like this issue is being managed. So they can just get up and walk around their house throughout their day and not feel like, oh my gosh, am I going to have a stroke because of my high blood pressure? Am I going to pass out because of orthostatic hypotension? That's what matters to them the most. I guarantee it. I guarantee you, if you spend the time to figure this out and advocate, it's going to be more important than if they were able to do 12 single leg bridges on this session versus 8 on the last session. Okay? Triage managing the chronic disease first. Ditch the fitness for a visit. All right. So we need to create a blood pressure diary. This is very, very important to gather the data so you can present this not only to the patient and their caregivers, but also the physicians and their team that is on board, and also your other colleagues who are coming to work with the patient as well. So, starting this blood pressure diary, what does the literature say what type of values and when? Like, what type of data should you be getting? The literature is going to say that we should get values 3 times a day, in the morning, after lunch, and bedtime, in the supine, seated, and standing positions. Because we want to try and capture, do we have supine hypertension on board? Do we have orthostatic hypotension on board? And when it is occurring. So after lunch, for example, is a big one because a lot of folks with Parkinson's disease can have postprandial hypotension. So their blood pressure drops after eating. So it's not just important to get the blood pressure values in different positions throughout the day, but it's very, very important to also put down what activities are being performed at the time. So what time they were as well. So what time did you have lunch? What was the blood pressure before in those positions, during, after? I added on this blood pressure diary that I helped create with my patient's husband. I mean, his name was Marvin. He just had an old school notebook, and we folded the notebook into a bunch of sections and put everything down, pen and paper. So I added pre-exercise, during exercise, and post-exercise. So I did end up giving her on my second visit a workout she could do that would not exacerbate the blood pressure, but I wanted it to be monitored anyway to see what was going on. So that's a lot of data, right? We're asking this caregiver and this client to get tens of measurements all throughout the day in different positions after certain activities. That's a lot of work on them. So this is something that you're going to have a competent caregiver to do, cognitively intact. Lots of times that's not feasible for a lot of folks, and I totally understand that. Another thing we can do when taking all these manual measurements is maybe not feasible, perhaps we can recommend to the healthcare team to start an ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. So basically that would be they come home with a cuff around their arm, and that measurement is being taken automatically every 15 to 30 minutes. Now, I am currently still in the process of speaking to this patient's cardiologist to try and facilitate getting this ambulatory blood pressure monitoring to her home, get the cuff on, facilitate that care so that the doctor can be able to have those automatic measurements, and that takes the burden off of the caregivers. However, for those of you who do have clients and caregivers or family who are competent, I would just start there, and I would start that day one. You're getting multiple blood pressure measurements in supine, sitting, and standing positions, AM, after lunch, PM, pre, during, and post exercise if you have provided an exercise program or some sort of activity. And then I would add on their medication dosages and times as well. So if they're on levodopa, if they're taking medication for their blood pressure already, any medication they're on, I would add a column for that and what time they're taking it, what dosage they're taking. You are just gathering all of this data. If you're familiar with ICE, you know that Jeff Moore says you can't make good decisions with bad data. You can't make even decent decisions with no data. So you're gathering all this data for a week, and then you have to contact the entire healthcare team, right? Which is a whole task in and of itself. Cardiology, neurology, PCP. They are all managing a lot of patients who have Parkinson's disease. They are all administering their own medications. They have to be aware. So you need to get them all on board. I sent an e-fax to all of them, right? Because like a three-way call is not going to happen with 3 doctors' offices. Sent them an e-fax about this is the data that we have. The patient, the patient's caregiver have an entire notebook full of a week's worth of data. I need you all to discuss and help to manage the blood pressure issues that are on board. Now, I have gotten some pushback from cardiology to be like, well, this is not a heart issue. It's just because she has Parkinson's. We need to not accept an answer like that because, as we already talked about, even if not the etiology, the root of the issue isn't coming from the heart, it's going to create cardiac and vascular issues down the road. So we have to really advocate and push to get all of the healthcare team on board, and that starts with gathering the data. Now, many of you are probably thinking, okay, but like that's going to take my entire session. That's going to take so much time. I want to make sure they exercise in some way. If that's still a really high priority to you, I would suggest that you leverage your other teammates. This is where you are calling up your OT who is seeing the patient that day and saying, hey, I was not able to get to any exercise today. We really didn't do any transfers. I spent the entire session monitoring blood pressure and helping them start a blood pressure diary. Would you please make transfers a priority for today, in addition to what you had planned? We have to utilize our teammates. We are never supposed to have to do all of this management on our own, so we have to reach out. Make sure that you're talking to the nurse who's on board to make sure that the client and the caregiver are administering the right medications at the right time and they know what they're for. Because we can measure all these blood pressures and they can do a great job of that. But if they're not taking meds at the right time, or they're not taking the right dosages, or they're missing meds, then it completely invalidates all our data. So make sure that we've got OT and nursing on board as well. Utilize your teammates. All right. If any of you have any experience with advocating for your patients to get ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, if anyone has had any success with that, I would love to hear about it. This is the first time that I have ever tried to get this on board with one of my patients. So if any of you have an experience, please comment or reach out. I'd love to hear about it. And just to kind of end with something I thought about this morning, many of you in the ICE community know that Jeff Moore says, manage symptoms to maximize fitness, right? And I started to think, like, when we're talking about sick older adults, it really becomes we need to help manage their chronic disease so they can live long enough to maximize their fitness. So when you're working with these populations, I want you to keep that thought front of mind. All right, for a lot of you, you guys have folks with Parkinson's disease on your caseloads all day. So I want you to really walk in the door and first thing, think ditch the deadlifts, start that blood pressure diary. All right, y'all, have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.